74 men stood armed in the town square, trembling like whipped dogs before a single solitary figure. He didn't draw his Winchester. He just spat in the dirt, pointed a calloused finger at the baker's heavy-set daughter, and grumbled the words that sealed her fate. "I'll take the fat one." Winter was a cruel mistress in the Colorado Territory of 1,883, but the town of Bitter Creek had survived it, entirely on borrowed time and borrowed meat. The man they owed was Gideon McCall. He was a mountain of a man who lived up in the jagged crags of the Sawtooth Range, a solitary trapper and logger who only came down when the snow thawed. When the railroad company went bankrupt and the supply trains stopped coming last November, Bitter Creek had been staring down the barrel of mass starvation. It was Gideon who had driven his mules down the treacherous mountain passes, delivering cords of chopped firewood and salted elk meat to the freezing townsfolk. He hadn't done it for charity. He had a ledger, and every mayor, merchant, and coward in Bitter Creek had signed it. The price was $500 in gold, payable on the first day of spring. Now, spring had sprung. The mud was thick in the streets, and Mayor Hiram Carmichael was sweating straight through his wool suit inside the town hall. Standing at the back of the crowded, suffocating room was Clementine Hayes. At 22, she was an anomaly in the harsh, starving West. While the other women of Bitter Creek were hollow-cheeked and frail, prone to fainting spells and corseted waistlines, Clementine was a woman of undeniable, substantial bulk. She was heavy-set, round-faced, with thick thighs and broad shoulders built from hauling 50-pound sacks of flour for her uncle's bakery since she was 12. The town made no secret of their disdain for her size. The gossiping hens at the general store whispered that she ate more than a workhorse, while the young men used her as the punchline for their cruelest saloon jokes. Clementine had long ago armored her heart, burying her quiet romantic hopes beneath layers of stoic, calloused indifference. The heavy oak doors of the hall slammed open, silencing the murmurs. Gideon McCall stood in the doorway, blocking out the afternoon sun. He wore a heavy bearskin coat despite the warming weather, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his bearded, scarred face. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, swept over the terrified townsfolk. "The snow's melted, Carmichael." Gideon's voice rumbled like distant thunder, echoing off the wooden rafters. "I've come for my gold." Mayor Hiram swallowed hard, gripping the edges of his podium. "Mr. McCall, Gideon, we are eternally grateful for your provisions. Truly. But the spring cattle drive hasn't begun. The bank in Denver denied our loan. We have no gold." Gideon didn't flinch. He slowly walked down the center aisle. Men stepped back, pulling their wives behind them. "A debt is a debt. You signed the ledger, Hiram. What do you have?" "We've gathered what we could," the mayor pleaded, gesturing to a pathetic pile near the stage. 3 sickly milk cows, 2 dozen chickens, Mrs. Gable's silver tea set, and the deed to the old Henderson plot, though the well is dry. Gideon stared at the insulting pile of junk. He let out a low, dangerous laugh that made the hairs on the back of Clementine's neck stand up. "You think my winter labor is worth 3 dying cows and a teapot? I lost 2 good mules bringing you that meat. I froze 3 toes on my left foot, keeping your children from turning into ice blocks. You will pay me something of actual value, or I will burn this town to the ground, building by building, starting with your house, Hiram." Panic erupted. Women sobbed. Men reached for holsters they didn't have the courage to unsnap. Clementine watched from the back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt a bizarre detachment, a spectator to the town's pathetic cowardice. Gideon turned his back on the mayor and began to walk through the crowd, his sharp eyes assessing the people. He was looking for labor. A blacksmith? A carpenter? The town held its breath. Then Gideon stopped. He was standing directly in front of Clementine. She stared up at him, refusing to shrink back. She wiped flour-dusted hands on her stained apron, her chin jutting out in defiance. He was a foot taller than her, smelling of pine needles, leather, and wood smoke. For a long, agonizing minute, those icy blue eyes mapped her face, her broad shoulders, her sturdy frame. Gideon turned his head slightly toward the mayor, though his eyes never left Clementine. He raised a thick, leather-gloved finger and pointed directly at her chest. "I'll take the fat one as payment." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so quiet Clementine could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "What?" Mayor Hiram squeaked. "You heard me," Gideon growled. $500 in gold, or her. I need a woman up on the ridge, someone to keep the hearth, salt the meat, and survive the winter. She goes with me, and your debt is cleared." Clementine's blood turned to ice water. She looked at her uncle, the man she had worked to the bone for since she was an orphan. Her uncle looked away, staring firmly at his boots. "Now, see here, Mr. McCall," Hiram stammered, putting up a weak front. "You can't just take a human being. That's unlawful. It's uncivilized." "Uncivilized?" Gideon stepped toward the stage, his hand resting on the handle of the hunting knife at his belt. "Starving to death because you're too proud to hunt is uncivilized. Handing her over saves your town, unless one of you brave men wants to step up and stop me." Not a single man moved. Not the sheriff, not the reverend, not her uncle. The town of Bitter Creek was perfectly willing to sacrifice their heaviest, most ridiculed outcast to save their own skins. "She's yours," Hiram said quickly, his voice cracking. "Debt paid in full." Clementine felt a hot tear track down her cheek, but she furiously wiped it away. Betrayal was a bitter pill, but she refused to let them see her choke on it. She looked at Gideon McCall, her dark eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce hatred. "I ain't a sack of grain you can just barter, mountain man," she spat. Gideon looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "No, you're worth a damn sight more than grain. Go pack your things, girl. We leave in an hour." Clementine's entire life was condensed into a single canvas rucksack. 2 dresses, an iron skillet her mother had left her, a brush, and a well-read copy of Jane Austen. When she emerged from the bakery, the streets were entirely deserted. The cowards of Bitter Creek were hiding behind drawn curtains, watching their sacrificial lamb being led to the slaughter. Gideon was waiting by the livery. He hadn't brought a wagon. Instead, he held the reins of a massive, muscular draft horse, a beast nearly as imposing as he was. "Get on," he instructed, gesturing to the saddle. Clementine stared at it. "I don't ride. Especially not monstrosities like that." Without a word, Gideon stepped forward, wrapped his massive hands around her thick waist, and hoisted her up into the saddle with shocking ease. Clementine gasped, her face flushing crimson. No man had ever lifted her before. She had always been too heavy, too solid. The effortless display of his raw strength sent an unfamiliar shiver down her spine. He swung up behind her, his chest pressing against her back, his arms coming around her sides to grab the reins. "Hold on," he muttered, his breath warm against her ear. The journey up the Sawtooth Range was brutal. The tree line swallowed them within an hour, the temperature dropping sharply as they ascended the rocky, treacherous switchbacks. Clementine sat rigidly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified. What was a wild, isolated man going to do with a woman he bought like a piece of livestock? The stories whispered about mountain men were horrifying. They were savages, uncouth brutes who worked their women to death or treated them like dogs. For 4 hours, they rode in silence, save for the crunch of hooves on gravel and the howling wind. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black, the cold bit into Clementine's thin shawl. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Suddenly, the horse stopped. Gideon dismounted. "We setting up camp?" she asked, her voice trembling, fearing what the darkness would bring. "No." "Almost there," Gideon replied. He unbuttoned his heavy, fur-lined bearskin coat, pulled it off, and threw it up to her. "Put it on." Clementine stared at the coat. "You'll freeze." "I'm used to it." "You ain't. Put it on before you catch a chill and become useless to me." His words were harsh, but the action was undeniably protective. Clementine wrapped the massive, heavy coat around her broad shoulders. It smelled deeply of him, cedar, horse sweat, and rain. It was incredibly warm. An hour later, they broke through a clearing, and Clementine saw her new prison. It wasn't a dilapidated shack, as she had expected. It was a large, beautifully constructed log cabin, built with masterful precision. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. Behind it sat a sturdy barn and a woodshed stacked 10 feet high with chopped logs. It was a fortress of survival. Gideon helped her down. Her legs were like jelly, and she stumbled. His large hand caught her elbow, steadying her effortlessly. Inside, he commanded. She walked into the cabin and stopped in her tracks. The interior was remarkably clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated the room, casting a warm glow over a heavy wooden table, cast iron pots, and a large bed covered in thick furs in the corner. Books lined a hand-carved shelf on the far wall. "Sit," he told her, pointing to a rocking chair by the fire. Clementine stubbornly remained standing. The adrenaline, the fear, and the profound humiliation of the day finally boiled over. She threw his heavy coat onto the floor and spun to face him, her hands on her wide hips. "All right, let's get this over with," she demanded, her voice shaking but loud. "Why did you take me? You need a slave to scrub your floors? You plan to butcher me and eat me for winter stores? Or did you just take the ugliest, fattest girl in Bitter Creek to humiliate them?" Gideon, who was stoking the fire with an iron poker, slowly turned around. The flickering orange light cast deep shadows across his rugged face. He didn't look angry at her outburst. He looked tired. "I don't need a slave," he said softly, walking over to a cupboard and pulling out a tin of coffee. "I kept this cabin clean by myself for 5 years, and I have enough elk meat to last a decade, so I won't be eating you." "Then why?" she cried out, a tear finally escaping. "Why me? Why not Sarah Jenkins, or the mayor's pretty daughter? Why the fat one?" Gideon slammed the tin down on the table, the sudden noise making her jump. He walked slowly toward her, stopping only when he was inches away. He looked down into her tear-filled, defiant eyes. "Because I watched your town all winter, Clementine," he said, using her name for the first time. The sound of it on his deep voice sent a strange jolt through her. "When I brought the meat down, I sat on the ridge with my glass. I saw Sarah Jenkins hoarding apples while children starved. I saw the mayor's pretty daughter refuse to step in the mud to help a fallen old man. And I saw you." Clementine's breath hitched. "You saw me?" "I saw you haul cordwood by yourself when the men were too weak," Gideon continued, his eyes locked onto hers with intense sincerity. "I saw you give your own rations to the blacksmith's orphans. I saw you work from dawn till midnight, carrying the weight of that town on your back, while they laughed at you for being heavy. You think your size makes you a punchline? Up here, on this mountain, a delicate flower dies in the first frost. Up here, flesh and bone and strength are what keep you breathing." He reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently wiping the tear from her plump cheek. The touch was astonishingly tender for a man of his size. "I didn't take you to punish you, Clementine. I took you because you were the only damn thing in that miserable town worth $500 in gold." Clementine stood frozen, her heart performing a wild, erratic dance in her broad chest. For 22 years, her body had been her greatest shame, her cross to bear. Now, this terrifying, mysterious mountain man was looking at her as if she were a prize he had pillaged from a conquered kingdom. "You're shivering," Gideon muttered, stepping back and breaking the spell. He walked over to the stove and began to pour water into a pot. "Sit by the fire. I'll make us some supper. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in a week." Clementine sank into the rocking chair, staring at the broad, muscular back of the man who had bought her. The terror that had gripped her all day was slowly melting away, replaced by a profound, bewildering confusion. She had expected a monster. She had expected a tyrant. Instead, she sat by a warm fire, watching the most feared man in the territory cook her a meal, wondering for the first time in her life what it might feel like to be truly valued. Spring surrendered to the sweltering heat of a Colorado summer, but up on the Sawtooth Ridge, the air remained crisp and fiercely pure. Weeks blurred into months, and the invisible cage that had trapped Clementine her entire life began to shatter. Down in Bitter Creek, her heavy, sturdy frame had been a curse, a reason for cruel whispers and public mockery. Up here, it was a magnificent, undeniable asset. Surviving the frontier was brutal, back-breaking labor, and Gideon never treated her like a fragile china doll to be hidden away. He taught her how to skin a buck, how to track a wounded mountain lion, and how to swing a felling axe so the pine fell exactly where she wanted it. She worked alongside him, her thick arms chopping cordwood, her broad shoulders hauling buckets of water from the icy creek. She was breathing mountain air, eating hearty meals of roasted elk and wild potatoes, and for the first time in 22 years, nobody was looking at her plate with disgust. Gideon was a quiet man, speaking more with calloused hands and lingering looks than with words. He watched her constantly. When she wiped sweat from her plump, flushed cheeks after splitting a pile of oak, his icy blue eyes tracked the movement with a dark, simmering intensity. He didn't just accept her size, he revered it. One evening in late August, a fierce summer thunderstorm rolled over the ridge. Thunder rattled the cabin's sturdy timbers, and rain lashed against the oilskin windows. Clementine was kneading thick dough on the heavy wooden table, leaning her substantial weight into the work. Gideon sat by the hearth, oiling his Winchester, though his gaze had been fixed on her for the better part of an hour. "You're working too hard," Gideon murmured, his deep voice cutting through the crackle of the fire and the boom of thunder. Clementine pushed a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead, leaving a smudge of flour on her brow. "Bread won't rise if the dough ain't beat into submission, Gideon. You ought to know that by now." He set the rifle aside and stood up. He walked across the room with the silent, predatory grace of a timber wolf, stopping just behind her. Clementine froze as she felt the radiant heat of his massive chest against her back. His large, rough hands reached around, covering hers, halting her movements in the dough. "I bought you to keep the hearth," he said softly, his breath fanning the sensitive skin of her neck, "not to work yourself into the grave." Clementine's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm perfectly fine. I'm strong enough to handle it." "I know exactly how strong you are, Clementine." He gently turned her around by her wide hips. The firelight danced across his scarred face. "But strength doesn't mean you have to bear the weight of the world alone anymore. You aren't hauling the burdens of cowards now." He lifted a hand, gently wiping the flour from her forehead. His thumb traced the soft, full curve of her cheek, lingering on her jawline. Clementine looked up into those striking eyes and saw a profound, undeniable hunger. It wasn't the ravenous, ugly hunger of starvation she had seen in the townsfolk. It was a deep, powerful longing for her. The realization hit her with the force of a runaway train. He desired her, all of her, the heavy thighs, the soft stomach, the broad shoulders. "Gideon," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't let her finish. He leaned down and captured her lips with his. The kiss was like the man himself, rugged, demanding, and incredibly warm. Clementine gasped, her thick arms rising to wrap around his thick neck. She pressed her generous, heavy body against his solid muscle, and for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful. She felt worshipped. But the mountain's peace was an illusion, and the cruelty of the world below had not forgotten them. 2 weeks later, the crisp autumn air carried a scent that made Gideon's blood run cold. Coal smoke and sweat. They were down by the creek, hauling traps, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed up the canyon. Gideon pushed Clementine behind a cluster of boulders, his Winchester instantly raised to his shoulder. Riding up the narrow switchback were 5 men. 4 of them wore long dusters and carried repeating rifles across their saddles. The man in the center, riding a pristine white gelding, wore a sharp pinstripe suit and a bowler hat. He looked entirely out of place in the rugged wilderness, reeking of expensive cigars and city money. Gideon stepped out from the rocks, his rifle aimed squarely at the man in the suit. "That's far enough, Abernathy. Josiah Abernathy, a ruthless railroad tycoon whose name was feared from Denver to Cheyenne, reined in his horse. He smiled, a thin serpentine curving of his lips. "Mr. McCall, still playing the savage hermit, I see." "This is private land," Gideon growled. "Turn around before I put a bullet in your custom leather saddle." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken," Abernathy said smoothly, reaching into his coat and pulling out a crisp, folded document bearing the official seal of Governor Frederick Pitkin. "This land is no longer yours. It belongs to the Colorado Central Railroad." Clementine stepped out from behind the rocks, her eyes wide with shock. Abernathy's eyes flicked to her, dripping with disdain. "I see you brought the baker's heifer up here with you. Mayor Hiram told me about your little arrangement. Speak to her with respect, or I'll cut your tongue out," Gideon snapped, the hammer of his rifle clicking back. "I filed the deed to this ridge 10 years ago, and you owed the town of Bitter Creek taxes for the access roads you used to haul your furs," Abernathy countered, his smile widening. "Taxes the town graciously allowed you to ignore until they went completely broke. The town council voted last week. They seized this property to pay their municipal debts and sold the deed to me to fund a new rail spur. Your clear debt for the girl was a magnificent distraction, Gideon. Hiram played you for a fool. You own nothing." The revelation struck Clementine like a physical blow. The town hadn't just sacrificed her to save their own lives. They had used her as a smokescreen to steal Gideon's home. Mayor Hiram and her own uncle had sold them both out to Abernathy's greed. The gold, the starvation, the debt, it was all a manipulated snare. "I'm not leaving," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "I brought 4 armed men from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency who say otherwise," Abernathy sneered. "We are here to survey the pass for blasting. You have 10 minutes to clear out of that cabin, or my men will bury you beneath it." "Try it," Gideon spat. The valley erupted into chaos. One of the Pinkerton men, eager to prove his worth, snapped his rifle up and fired. The crack of the gunshot deafened Clementine. Gideon grunted, his body twisting violently as a bullet tore through his left shoulder. He stumbled backward, dropping to one knee, but managed to fire a return shot, blowing the Pinkerton man out of his saddle. "Gideon!" Clementine screamed. "Get to the cabin!" he roared, firing another blind shot as the remaining 3 mercenaries spurred their horses forward, drawing revolvers. Clementine didn't run to the cabin. Adrenaline, fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage and a fierce, protective love for the bleeding man in the dirt, exploded in her veins. She was not a helpless maiden. She was a woman built by the brutal labor of the West. Near the creek bank sat Gideon's logging wagon, loaded with massive, unhewn oak trunks. The wagon was propped up by a heavy wooden chuck beneath the rear wheel, holding it steady on the steep incline directly above the narrow trail the Pinkertons were charging up. Clementine sprinted for the wagon. Her heavy boots pounded the dirt, her broad, powerful legs driving her forward with surprising speed. Bullets kicked up dust around her heels, but she didn't flinch. She threw her substantial weight against the heavy wooden chuck holding the wagon wheel in place. It was wedged tight, bearing thousands of pounds of pressure. A normal woman would have broken her wrists trying to budge it, but Clementine planted her thick, sturdy legs into the mud. She grabbed the heavy wooden block with both hands, let out a guttural, furious scream, and heaved upward with every ounce of strength in her massive shoulders and back. Muscles tore, splinters bit into her palms, but the wood groaned, shifted, and finally ripped free. The wagon, carrying 3 tons of dead oak, lurched forward. Gravity took hold instantly. The massive cart barreled down the steep incline with the terrifying roar of an avalanche. The Pinkerton men looked up, their eyes widening in sheer terror. "Look out!" one screamed. It was too late. The wagon slammed into the horses. Wood splintered, men shouted, and the sheer force of the collision swept Abernathy's hired guns off the trail, sending them tumbling down the rocky, thorny ravine in a cloud of dust and broken pride. Josiah Abernathy's white horse reared up in a panic, throwing the tycoon face first into the muddy bank of the creek. He scrambled to his knees, gasping for air, only to find the cold, dark barrel of Gideon's Winchester pressed directly against his forehead. Gideon stood above him, blood pouring down his left arm, his chest heaving. Clementine stood a few yards away, panting heavily, her dress torn and her hands bleeding, looking like an avenging Valkyrie of the mountains. Abernathy swallowed hard. His arrogant sneer completely vanished, replaced by pale, trembling terror. You can't shoot me. I have the governor's seal. I have the deed." Gideon reached into Abernathy's coat, pulled out the folded document, and tossed it into the rushing waters of the creek. "A piece of paper doesn't make you a man of the mountain, Josiah. Blood and sweat do. If I ever see your face, or the face of any man from Bitter Creek on my ridge again, I will hunt you down and leave your bones for the wolves. Do you understand?" Yes, I understand," Abernathy squealed. "Now take your broken men and get off my land." Abernathy scrambled to his feet and ran down the ravine, desperately calling for his battered mercenaries. Gideon watched them retreat until they were nothing but specks in the distance. Then the adrenaline faded. His knees buckled. "Gideon!" Clementine rushed to his side, dropping to her knees. She ripped the hem of her apron off and immediately began tying a tourniquet around his bleeding shoulder, her thick, capable hands moving with practiced, steady pressure. He winced, but his icy blue eyes locked onto her face. He reached up with his good arm, ignoring the blood and the dirt, and pulled her down by the back of her neck. He kissed her fiercely, sealing a bond that no tycoon, no town council, and no piece of paper could ever sever. "You saved my life," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. Clementine smiled, tears finally spilling over her thick lashes, cutting tracks through the soot and dirt on her cheeks. "I told you, mountain man, I ain't a sack of grain. You bought a partner." Gideon let out a rough, booming laugh that echoed off the canyon walls. He pulled her heavy, magnificent body tightly against his chest, holding her as if she were the only precious thing left in the entire world. Down in the valley, the cowardly town of Bitter Creek would eventually rot, choking on their own deceit and unpaid debts. But up on the Sawtooth Ridge, a fortress of true strength had been built. Gideon McCall had demanded the Fat One as payment, and in doing so, he had gained a queen who would rule the mountain by his side until the end of their days. Don't forget to hit that like button if you loved this Wild West tale of revenge, love, and untamed justice. Subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, real-life historical stories brought to life. Share this video with your friends to let them know that true strength comes in all shapes and sizes. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Clementine's heroic stand. Your support keeps these stories alive.